Our last speaker, and even from another perspective, is Gaylon Layfield. And Gaylon is president of CEO of Xenith Bank, which is a very cool concept. And it's a startup bank, and they really didn't have the problems that the other banks had from the past. In Gaylon's past, he was with Xenith Bank and was involved in all aspects in guiding that organization. I know Gaylon. I went to collegiate with him. Well, let me be clear. I sat in the back of the room, and he sat in the front of the room, and I only went to collegiate for 3 years. My parents brought me into the bedroom, and they said, "Son, you're not going back to collegiate." And I went, "How come?" They said, "It's cheaper for you to fail in public school." Gaylon is the exact opposite of that. He is one brainy, smart guy. He is not only involved in family investment in timberlands and their own personal assets, but also this very creative venture, and I'm looking forward to hear what your comments on where we need to go. Let's welcome Gaylon Layfield.
So Sidney, who maybe did sit in the back of the class, reminds me, though, of the facts in life, which are that the A students, go off and get smarty kind of pants jobs. The B students, run businesses and so forth. And the C students, all the rest of us work for them. So there you go. The other testimony to what Sidney had to say not being completely accurate is that I'm the only one with 3 different topics today. Sidney gave me those topics because he knows I don't have enough to say about any one topic to fill up my time. So I'm going to talk about 3 things sort of quickly, thinking that you'll ask questions later if it spurs any questions. One is timber as an investment, and Lawrence really talked about that in some aspects. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about timber. I want to talk a little bit about banking as it relates to commercial real estate, banking sort of in general, and then I will make a few comments, self-serving, of course, about Xenith. And then finally, my last topic, this I promise you will be short, is banking as a user of real estate. You might imagine what the answer is to that question here, given the consolidation that's taken place in the industry. So let's see, I do this right? So now let's look at timber as an investment. Generally, an attractive asset class with very attractive risk-adjusted returns. If you just look at this slide, it's not all asset classes, but it's equities, treasuries, or bonds, but with a 10-year treasury and in timber. And then I also show there the standard deviation in blue. So back to, again, a point Lawrence was making about risk-adjusted returns. Timber is a very attractive, this is over 25 years, very attractive category of assets, particularly as you think about it on a risk-adjusted basis. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme, but it's steady. And one of the things that I like about it, and really appeals to me, is it's not very complicated. So here are the sort of 2 or 3 key things about investing in timberland that I think maybe would be interesting. Number 1, there are a number of different ways to play. There are timber REITs, public companies. Plum Creek would be an example. You can simply buy stock in Plum Creek and you've got a timber play. There are things called TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations. They're kind of like PE firms. They bring together equity. They manage the money and they invest it in timberland for you. You can invest in one of those, just takes a little bit more money to play that way. And then finally, you can simply make direct investments, which is what the Gray family had done, which my family had done some over the years, and which I have enjoyed doing. You got to get a little more hands-on, but you sort of take the middleman out of it, and I think done right, your returns can maybe even be superior to what you would get in a more public kind of an environment. 2 components to the business, obviously, land and timber, right? Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. The land piece of it is really around the land acting as a factory. It grows the tree. Now, there are some other aspects to land that we've alluded to, which is the developmental potential, potentially, of land. As a timber investor, my view has always been sort of better lucky than smart as it relates to something turning out well with the development potential. I'd rather buy the land and know that the price I paid for the land will allow me to grow a tree profitably over a reasonable period of time. If I get lucky and an interchange comes through, you know, I'll call Bill or Will or somebody and get them to tell me what to do because I don't have a clue. So that's the land component of the thing. The timber piece of it, and this is where it becomes very predictable. Your return on the timber side is fundamentally from biological growth. And that is whether you're in a pine forest or whether you're in a hardwood forest, and they're really the two around here. 85 or 90% of it, I guess, Lawrence, these days is certainly pine. We're in the pine belt, southern pine belt. It is biological growth, and it is very predictable. The other thing, so you're going to get, you know, a certain amount of growth every year, call it 4 to 6%. The other thing that you will achieve in owning trees and having them grow is something called ingrowth, which is simply the tree becomes more valuable as it gains in size, diameter particularly, right? So there are three categories. There's pulpwood, there's something called chip and saw, which is kind of in the middle, and then there's sawmill timber, the big stuff that you saw up for all kinds of manufactured purposes. As that tree grows through those three stages, it becomes more valuable on a per cubic foot basis as it gets larger. And that's really what it's all about. Now, there are some downsides. This doesn't happen overnight. Trees are just a crop, but it takes somewhere between 25 and 50 years to grow the crop. So you say, well, you know, I buy today, I get cash 50 years from now, net present value, that's not so sporty. The way you get around that problem is think about it like a laddered bond portfolio. You own different age classes of trees so that over a cycle you can reasonably predictably generate some cash flow off of that investment portfolio. Back to why sometimes it makes sense to do it through some sort of a structured vehicle and not try and do it independently. If you want to do it independently, you've got to buy multiple tracks, multiple age stands, and so forth, unless you simply are willing to wait for your, 12% return, but only get your cash at the end of a pretty long cycle. So that's the timber business. We could go into a lot more detail, but I won't. Sort of looking ahead, there's a very smart investor, most of you probably heard of him, sort of in the category of a Warren Buffett. This guy's Jeremy Grantham. There's a firm up in Boston, Grantham Mayo. They have been in the timber business as managers and investors for a long, long time. If you looked at this chart for their prediction of asset classes over the next 20 years, timber would be at the top of the list in terms of the asset classes that they think will perform well. I would suggest it's not an asset class. Back to diversification, we were talking, Michael's talking about that. It's not a class you want all your assets in, but it is a very attractive asset class. There's an old adage that I heard as a young kid hanging around my grandfather and fathers and other folks in the family, and that is that you might keep in mind about timberland. You make all your money the day you buy the land in timber. In other words, you got to get the price right going in, or you won't get the returns that you expect. All right, so that's timber. On to something that I might know a little bit more about, just because I've spent more time in it. That's banking, although I wouldn't claim to be an expert there either. And that world is changing pretty rapidly. Also, current reality. We've been through a very tough cycle. Banks are adjusting to what has transpired and what we see as we look down the road in terms of economic growth in this country. If you think about the banking industry, in many ways, it is simply a reflection of the overall economy. If the economy grows 4%, it's a little hard to imagine that all the banks are going to grow much more than 4% over any period of time. There may be some exceptions to that rule. Sidney mentioned Capital One. I was part of Xenith Bank. You know, those guys were very bright. We brought in back to, you need somebody that's really smart, not the bankers. We got some guys from the outside that really understood the credit card business. They had insights around consumer behavior that no one else had. They applied it to the credit card business, and the rest was sort of history as it related to Capital One. That is not characteristically what you see of the banking industry. It's a little bit more like the timber industry, which is done right. It's a fairly steady, decent risk-adjusted return. That said, we seem as management in the banking world to make lots of mistakes along the way over the years. So let's talk about sort of what the market looks like as it relates to banks. It tends to be a bit of a barbell. You think about the banking market right here in our own backyard. We've got a handful, 5, maybe 6, very large mega banks that are national banks. See CTA here, he worked for one of them for a long, long time, SunTrust, before that Creststar. We've seen consolidation in the industry. It's rolled up all these banks into a handful of very large ones. They have 75% of the market share, and they have that all across this country, in every market you go in virtually. The other 25% of the market share, you got another 100 of us in the state of Virginia fighting over, which is typically called community banks. So let's talk about the real estate sort of aspect of it. Banks, in many ways, not unlike, I think, in some ways, developers, we sort of have this love-hate relationship, right? We love the business, particularly today, and on and off through the cycles. There is always demand for credit in the real estate world. Thank goodness. That's also a problem sometimes. We, as bankers, allow ourselves to get a little carried away, and we do things that we probably shouldn't be doing, take risks that we shouldn't take, and then we have a downturn and we see what can sometimes happen, as we experienced over the course of the last few years. Let's look at a bank slide here. This is total real estate concentrations in large banks, all Virginia banks, and then, Virginia banks, and Virginia large banks. One of the problems in this last downturn with the community banks was the fact that you will see there, over time, their concentration in real estate assets, this includes consumer real estate assets, or residential, but it got to 75 to 90% of the balance sheet. I mean, none of us, right, as investors, well, maybe most of us anyway, wouldn't want to have 75 or 90% of our assets in any one asset class. And particularly in the banking industry, we're a very highly leveraged industry. So when things go wrong, they tend to get amplified. The large bank average you see there as having risen some over the years, but still down under 50% of assets, a much more modest exposure to real estate in general. And I was part of one of the relatively large banks back in the mid-1980s. We learned our lessons sort of the hard way, late 80s, early 90s, and at that point in time, the regulators came down pretty hard on the big banks, and asset concentrations have been modified considerably since that point in time. Not so much for the smaller banks. And then the red line there, it's interesting, if you look at Xenith, just a little history on us, we bought, to get started, we acquired a typical community bank with a very large real estate concentration. You didn't see there over the course of the next 2 years where we worked very hard to bring that concentration down. Now, we were still making real estate loans because we were growing, we had plenty of capital, and we were trying to leverage our balance sheet. But in terms of percentage of our assets, we felt it was prudent to bring that down. The point being here that on the backside of this last meltdown, the regulators have pretty much subjected the entire banking universe to the same rules that they have held the larger banks accountable for since the late 1980s. And that is, they call them buckets. It's a 100% bucket, a 300% bucket. We won't say what's in the bucket, right? But the point is there is a limitation that the regulators will allow as it relates to real estate concentrations, and most banks are today at that limit, right? So as you think about the availability of credit to support real estate, it's not to say there won't be any, because you know that there is today. What happens, though, is that there's a fair degree of turnover in these portfolios, particularly, again, among the larger banks who tend to manage their portfolios that way. That's the way we manage ours, is you get turnover, there's opportunity to fulfill demand that's out there in the marketplace for new loans. The last thing I would say about the general environment today is banks are struggling to find revenue growth. Real estate's a place to lend money. Loan demand is weak. We saw a slide a while ago that was talking about the deleveraging that has occurred in the overall economy. So there's very anemic loan demand. There is demand on the real estate side. To the benefit of those of you that are in the development business, it's pretty competitive out there today from a banking standpoint in terms of the terms and conditions related to lending. There are some differences certainly in the way large banks and smaller banks tend to approach commercial real estate. I won't go into great detail around that. I would just say that as it relates to Xenith, we sort of tend to view ourselves a bit in the middle. We're certainly nowhere near the size of these mega organizations, but I think we manage our balance sheet, and particularly our real estate business, in many ways similarly, and then we try and overlay that responsiveness, the local knowledge, the experience, and the kind of customer focus that you might more typically associate in some cases with community banks on top of that expertise. Last thing I'll say about the banking business, this is something that we all sort of as mutual beneficiaries of this borrowing and lending game need to understand. And it's a lesson that I had pointed out to me one time when I was trying to get a loan approved, and my boss at the time felt it necessary to tame my youthful enthusiasm about how much risk the bank ought to be taking. He said, "You do understand the banking model, don't you?" Of course, got a degree from the Darden School. I understand the banking model. I didn't say that. That's what I thought. He says, "Well, you know the way it works. You get like 4% margin on your business. So we borrow money and we lend money out. We might, in good times, make 4%, making today 3.25% maybe. You got 2 to 2.5% of expenses, right, to run the business every day. You got to pay taxes. So that's 35% of whatever's left over at the end of the day. What's left for the banks to lose on loan losses, this is going to, I think, surprise a lot of people, is about 35 basis points. Now you tell me, how much risk can a bank take if over time all they can lose and meet a minimum level of profitability is 35 basis points? So when Sidney shows up and fusses at me about the fact that, when I can't borrow money unless I don't need it, right? It's because I can't lose by 35 basis points. But it is an interesting phenomenon. I don't think we all understand it particularly well, and so just, sort of for what it's worth, that's the truth. So my tagline for this part of the discussion is, again, what one of my mentor bosses said to me as he was retiring and was a little concerned about turning certain things over to me, and again, my sort of enthusiasm and failure to remember the banking model was, as he walked out the door, "Y'all be careful now." And then the last thing I'm supposed to talk about is banking industry and the demand for space. So this is a quick conversation. The answer is it's declining. This is how many banks existed. I think this goes back, I can't even see it, 84 or something. So we're down 50% in the number of banks in this country. We've gone from 14,000 to basically 7,000. If you just extrapolate that line, we'll be down to 3,500 over the next 20 years. If I had to bet, I think that's probably a pretty good bet. There's going to be more consolidation in the industry for a million of different reasons. So just by virtue of that, there's diminished demand for office space and operations space and those kind of things. Now, the other interesting phenomenon, however, given that this many banks have gone away, is this. This is the number of branches that banks have across the country and in Virginia. Left-hand side there is, or as I'm looking at, left-hand side is Virginia, right-hand side. So in the country, there are approximately 90,000 bank branches. 90,000 bank branches. That's been roughly true for the duration of this chart. My suggestion is that this is going to change. If for no other reason than technology, and the thing that Sidney reminded us all to turn off when we walked in here, which was our smartphone, and the fact that there are not a lot of young sort of 20-somethings, 30-somethings in this room, but you ask a 20 or 30-something-year-old when the last time was they went in a bank branch, and some of them don't even know what a bank branch is, much less have they been in it recently. So my very strong suspicion is that this number is going to change pretty dramatically. It will begin to follow what we saw in terms of total banks, and we'll see a big reduction, and that will play itself into the reduced demand for banks from a real estate standpoint. And my quote for the afternoon on that, or idea, is that I would suggest to you that there is a business opportunity for the developers in the adaptive reuse of bank branches. Thank you.